Amendment by Zwiener.
Ms. Zwiener.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members. There's a lot of good things in this bill about transparency and making sure parents have access to library records, but unfortunately there's some very problematic definitions in the bill that quite frankly leave this bill very vulnerable to the same sort of constitutional challenges that HB 900 had after last session. And so what my amendment does is it removes the parts that are most concerning, the definitions of the definitions of indecent content and the definitions of profane content. Members, I can understand why the authors of this bill thought it might be a good idea to take FCC standards and port them onto books, but unfortunately those are really, that's putting apples and oranges together. Broadcast standards are different because of the fact that people can end up encountering broadcast beyond their will. People could walk into a grocery store and hear what's on the radio. People could turn on their TV and be surprised by something without even a chance to change the channel. That's not how books work. To really end up encountering with content in a book, you have to pick up the book, you have to open it, and you have to read it. You have to engage. And so the Supreme Court has had two very different standards for how broadcast is handled and how books and libraries are handled. And so what my amendment does is it strikes these definitions related to broadcast. The other really important thing about broadcast is that it only applies between the hours of 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. It also doesn't apply to cable. It doesn't apply to satellite, because those are subscriptions you have chosen to engage with. And the other really important thing about broadcast is that how offensive something is depends on the time of day because of the age of child that might see something. There are things that are allowable in the 9 o'clock TV slot that would not be allowable in the 4 o'clock right after school gets out slot. You're not going to put Grey's Anatomy on at 4 p.m. in the afternoon. We all know that. But you can put it on at 7 or 8 o'clock when most of the little ones are in bed. So members, these definitions as written are unconstitutionally vague, are going to cause a lot of confusion, and are going to end up banning works that we really shouldn't be prohibiting from our schools. Works that many of us have probably read and engaged with when we were in school. Members, this could end up banning The Things They Carried, a beautiful war story written by an author who resides in Texas and teaches at Texas State University, Tim O'Brien. Members, that's one of the most widely read war novels by high school students. And do you know what word that book uses a lot? Well, I'm not going to say it because we got a lot of children here, but the word starts with an F and has 4 letters. And members, you're going to find that consistently in novels about the experience of war, is that there's a lot of use of profanity. But here we have a definition that is going to say books cannot be on library shelves if they have profane content. And we don't have a lot of clarity on how profane they have to be to apply. Members, this could apply to All the Pretty Horses, another book about Texas. Lonesome Dove, as Representative Tallarico raised earlier. Bless Me Ultima, a book that has also been widely read by Texas high school students. And members, I remember my teacher getting a little embarrassed when she had to explain to us what a few of the words in Spanish meant. But that's okay. It was still appropriate for high school students to engage with a book with a little bit of profanity. This could apply to A Lesson Before Dying, The Handmaid's Tale, Catcher in the Rye, The Color Purple, Slaughterhouse-Five. And I find the fact that this would apply to Slaughterhouse-Five particularly interesting because Slaughterhouse-Five is actually one of the books that the Supreme Court ordered back on the shelves in the landmark case of Pico versus Island Free Board of Trustees. This could apply to Catch-22, a book I read and loved in high school that has another great war novel, but that has a lot of scenes that take place in a brothel. This would apply to Huckleberry Finn, a book that uses the N-word more than 200 times throughout, but is still a classic work of literature that has value for our students. It would apply to Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian, Beloved, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, The Grapes of Wrath, The Sun Also Rises. Remember, these are authors that most of us have enjoyed and believe should be accessible.
Good one. For what purpose?
Will the gentlelady yield for questions?
Ms. Toth, for what purpose?
Will the gentlelady yield for questions?
Gentlelady yield for questions?
Not at this time.
Not at this time, Mr. Toth.
So, members, I want to point out that we are catching things we do not mean to catch with overly broad definitions, and we are catching books that in some instances, if we're looking at Hemingway, have been on school library shelves for almost 100 years without major problems. So we need to strike these problematic definitions, move forward with a narrower version of the bill that encourages transparency, and create some of these local engagement opportunities, but without unconstitutionally banning great works of literature. So members, I urge your support on this amendment, and I would be happy to yield for any questions.
Ms. Toth, for what purpose?
Will the gentlelady yield for questions?
I
Gentlelady
will.
yield for questions. She yields for questions.
You had
Mr.
refused
Toth,
to-
please scoot closer to the microphone.
I'm sorry. Representative, you didn't want to use a word that starts with an F earlier. Why is that?
Because this is a broadcast situation, unlike a library, and so I am going to use some standards around that.
So it's appropriate to use it in a school with little kids, but it's not appropriate to use it in a house full of adults, or a room full of adults.
You know, Representative Toth, I think that, well, first of all, this is not a room full of adults today. There are a lot of children. And second of all, there are
Good point.
And second of all, there are students who watch this space, and I think we have a standard of decorum that I do think is worth holding to. But
Let me ask you another question. Why do you...
Representative Toth, I want to
You
finish
bet. I
answering your
apologize.
question.
Go ahead.
You asked about little kids. I think the standards for what book belong in an elementary library are very different than the standards for what books belong in a high school library. And do I have questions about any four-letter words of other length being in books in a high school library? I don't. I don't have a single concern about that. And I got to say, I saw every single one of those words written on the stalls of the bathrooms in high school. I'm not concerned about books where we actually have complete sentences and stories around those words.
But the problem with a lot of these books, and you've failed to talk about it, is the fact that there are a lot of illustrations in these books, including girls giving each other oral sex, which is offensive.
Representative Toth, my amendment is about making sure we have constitutional standards here. This would, even with my amendment adopted, school districts can still have individual conversations about which books belongs in their libraries and which are appropriate for particular students and particular libraries and particular communities.
What's the difference between a child getting permission to look at something as opposed to banning?
Banning means that these books will be baseline unavailable across the state of Texas. That's what this language is saying.
They can't be purchased in a store?
Where many students
They
access
can't be
their...
purchased in a bookstore? They can't be purchased on Amazon? How are these books banned?
Well, I'm pretty sure we're trying to keep kids from being able to buy things on Amazon based on many bills we've passed off this floor. Students often get access through their school libraries, and long-standing Supreme Court precedent is that students do have a First Amendment right to information through their school libraries, and that we as a state should not be putting arbitrary lines on what material they have access to and what they don't.
But we're not banning anything. These kids still have access to these works. Isn't that true?
Representative Toth, we could get into a gigantic semantics argument here, but I do believe that pulling books off the shelf of the place where kids have the easiest free access to the material is banning.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Ms. Goodwin, for what purpose?
Will the gentlelady yield for
Gentlelady
some
yield for questions.
I will.
She yields for questions.
Thank you. I just wanted to make the point in your amendment online, it just says that we're removing some sections. Why are you removing the indecent aspect of this bill?
Because that is not a clear definition. It will be found unconstitutionally vague by a court, and it will end up covering works of literature that we, almost all, I should say, at least agree have value. Things like, again, Lonesome Dove, Beloved, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. And the other giant problem with these definitions is they're not tailored to age. And what is indecent for a 17-year-old is not the same as what is indecent for a 5-year-old. And I think we all know that and need to have a little bit of common sense as part of this conversation.
No, I completely agree with you based on the back and forth between you and Representative Toth. I think just here on the floor, we probably all have different ideas of what indecent means exactly. Why would you remove the profane aspect of the bill?
Yeah, I honestly have to say, I think the word profane and this language being in the bill is the part of it that bugs me the most. We all know, teenagers know every four-letter word. I think I learned all of them from classmates before I got out of elementary school. Wasn't a frequent user, but we all learned those early. And so acting like those individual words are dangerous and that kids being exposed to them in a book is going to cause harm, I just don't think that's real. And when teens want to read about their lives and about the experiences of other teens, those teens are often going to talk like them.
The gentlelady's time has expired.
Thank you.
Dr. Buckley in opposition.
Members, appreciate working with Representative Zwiener on so many things here, and I just happen to disagree with what this amendment does. It really strikes at the heart of what we're trying to do. Members, the titles that she mentioned and was concerned about, not one of those has ever been mentioned before my committee when I sat there for 40 plus hours over 2 sessions talking about what parents care about. So I do believe that's a little bit of a red herring argument. And with that, I respectfully move to table the amendment.
Ms. Zwiener to close.
So members, I was going to mention a famous narrator that used a lot of cuss words, and that was Holden Caulfield in Catcher in the Rye. And so we know that teens know profanity. We know that teens are aware that sex exists in the world. Members, we need to have reasonable standards for how we evaluate these books, not a blanket ban. And I think this bill can do a lot of good if we don't go beyond our constitutional limitations by banning content that is perfectly age appropriate for teens. And I want to be really clear. People keep trying to use the scare language of books around little kids. Nobody is saying, shoot, I don't know any 8-year-olds who want to read Catcher in the Rye. I don't know any 8-year-olds who want to read the things they carried. More power to them if their reading level's there. But members, those books
Mr.
don't
Speaker.
appeal.
For what purpose?
Will the gentlelady yield for a couple of
Gentlelady
questions?
yield for questions.
Not at this time.
Not at this time.
So we need to make sure we can actually have local standards that make sense and make sense for the library those books are being in, instead of doing this blanket prohibition on so much material that would be appropriate for teens just because we don't think it's appropriate for kindergartners. With that, I'd be happy to yield for questions.
For what purpose?
Will the gentlelady yield for
Gentlelady yield
questions?
for questions.
I do.
She yields for questions.
I believe you just said that there would be a blanket ban and that this should be handled locally instead. Is that correct?
I did.
Do you understand that that's what this bill does?
This bill does create some local committees, but it also puts prohibitions in the library guidelines put together by the Texas State Library and Archive Commission, and that's the part of the bill I'm amending where I think the blanket ban is being created.
But all of that would be enforced locally according to the local sense of what is right and wrong, and it would be handled first by a parental advisory committee that brings recommendations to the school board, and before a book could be taken out, it would require that school board in a public meeting with public available to be there to come forward and hear and vote in an open meeting, correct?
I think that's close to correct. I will say I don't think as currently written that the advisory councils are required. I think that's an option.
Okay,
But I want to be clear, Representative Money, I think that part of the bill is good, and I think it's good that Representative Buckley crafted it that way, and I don't have any concern about that part of the bill. I do have a concern that we're putting into statute that books that contain profane content are not allowed to be part of a library collection. And that is what we are putting in the TSLAC guidelines. So that's my concern. And I do agree there'll be some differences in how that's interpreted locally, but I do think we're creating a lot of ammunition for people to target books that most of us, using our common sense, know are perfectly fine for a 15 or 16-year-old.
But it would have to be targeted by people in that community saying we don't want this in our community and having the school board vote on it, correct?
Unfortunately, I don't entirely agree. I think we're seeing a lot of people self-censoring because of the actions we're taking as a legislature and being afraid to put perfectly okay books on the shelves because they're worried about what we're going to do next or who's going to come after them
I'm
for
not
it.
talking about self-censoring. I'm talking about what this bill does. And what this bill does is allow local people in a local community to go to their elected officials and say, we don't want this book or these books in our library. And it's an open and transparent process to get that done, correct?
I think the members of this body who have served on school boards will tell you that there's nothing they like less than a giant blow-up at a local meeting. And this bill, with these definitions as written, is setting them up for big fights over classic works of literature that I don't think are merited.
I don't think there are any local communities here, local ISDs in a public meeting that are going to ban classic literature books. But thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
The school district I attended actually had over 200 book challenges come from 1 or 2 people. And so we certainly have had drama around that regionally.
Mr. Speaker,
It's moved for what purpose?
would the lady yield for questions?
Gentlelady for questions?
I will.
Yields for
Representative
questions.
Zwiener, potentially, you could have books that are on the reading assignment list for schools that have been required reading for ages that could be banned by this board.
That's a little bit of a tricky question with the bill as amended because I do think Representative Buckley made some allowances for the text, and I actually really want to thank him for that. I think that's important. But you could have this dynamic where there's a book that's, because it's part of the curriculum, is allowable, and then a book that has the exact same content isn't because it's not part of the curriculum. And that feels pretty silly to me, that there are books that we say we can teach in the classroom, but the same content we can't put on our library shelves. That doesn't make a lick of sense.
Right, and earlier you were asked about what is the problem with allowing a community to raise objections. This is not a process where the whole community is going to go vote on this, right? There's not a referendum process where the whole community has the opportunity to come in and vote and say, I like this book, I don't like this book. It's not like that. And what's going to ultimately happen is it's going to be the lowest common denominator. So whoever has a problem with that book is going to come and they're going to raise the objections, even if not a single other person in the whole community cares or has a problem with it.
I think that's correct. I mean, I think the metaphor I'd use is the person who chooses to be president of the HOA is usually the one person who's really obsessive about trash cans and the length of grass. That's the same person who's going to try and go get on these book review councils.
Absolutely.
Which is a concern. It's the people who want there to be fewer books available and are super concerned about the content. And that's really unfortunate. Now, that said, I think Representative Buckley has come up with a mostly workable process, but I think the definitions in here create major issues and make it possible for these local councils or school board meetings, if they don't have a council, to be weaponized against particular works of literature.
And it is not unreasonable that certain communities may find different things objectionable, right?
Oh, absolutely. Different communities have different standards. I do think one thing that's really important, though, across the board that concerns me is we see bans against content like this being applied very unequally. Do I think someone is actually going to come challenge Lonesome Dove? No, I don't. And that's because it's about a Texas Western story that features mostly white people as heroes, and it's not going to bug anybody.
But they might challenge the color purple.
But people will come after the color purple. People will come after the bluest eye. People
right.
will come after Aristotle and Dante discover the secrets of the universe.
And in some sense, we in this body have kind of done that. We've created like this anti-DEI, anti-everything. It's already set the tone of we don't like books, we don't like things that discuss race, discuss the history of racial strife in this country, and all those things. They've already set the tone for that.
Absolutely. One of the most challenged recent young adult novels is a book called Out of Darkness by Ashley Hope Perez. It's set in Texas. It's about an interracial teen relationship. I think there's 3 pages in the book that have any sort of sexual content. I would not say that it is done in a patently offensive way, but that book has been one of the most targeted books across the state, and I'm not sure it would be if it wasn't for the race content in that book.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Members, I urge you...
Manual for purpose.
Would the gentlelady yield for
Gentlelady yield.
I will.
You brought up a point. You were saying that if the books are banned locally where they can't be in the library, they would still be able to be taught in the classroom. So where will those, do you know where those books will be held? Will they be in the classroom, in the janitor's closet until the students need to read them, for
Yeah,
instance?
I'm sorry. I want to clarify. I think the way Representative Buckley's bill will work, regardless of whether my amendment gets on, is that if a book is part of the text, if it's part of classroom learning, these rules just don't apply to it across the board. So I think that book could be in the library, but a book with identical content that wasn't actively being taught in the classroom could not be.
Thank you.
All right, members, I urge you to vote yes on this amendment. Let's actually set this bill up to survive constitutional scrutiny. I move adoption.
Ms. Weiner sends up an amendment. Dr. Buckley's moved to table. The questions on the motion to table. Record vote. Clerk, ring the bell. Dr. Buckley voting aye. Mr. King voting aye. Have all members voted? Have all members voted? 87 ayes, 59 nays. The motion to table prevails. Following amendment, clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment by Hinojosa.
Ms. Hinojosa.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. All this amendment does is say we have different standards for kids of different ages. After all, we have elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools. Shouldn't we have different standards when it comes to what we consider, for instance, profane, when we're talking about second graders versus when we're talking about 17, 18-year-olds in high school? We may not want our kids to grow up. We might want to keep them small and innocent, but they grow up. They're exposed to different things. That is appropriate, and it makes sense to me that we would recognize that in the legislation that we are passing here today. And so, again, all this amendment does is say, and I'll read it to you, library material containing indecent content or profane content as determined by prevailing community standards for the ages the materials are available to. We have here at the Austin Public Library, for example, a section. It's a beautiful library. If you haven't gone, I invite you to please go and experience what that is. But there's a section that is just for the teenagers, and you have to be a certain age to get into that section of the library. It is like a rite of passage, and I know my youngest son was always looking forward to be able to go into the teenagers' room to check out those books, look at those books, see what that's all about. There was a curiosity about it, too, because he knew that those were off limits to him as a young child. Now he can access that part of the library, and as he should, those materials are appropriate for his age, and we should do the same when it comes to our neighborhood schools. And I move adoption.
Howard, for what purpose?
With the gentlelady yield.
Gentlelady for questions?
I do.
Shields for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Representative Hinojosa. So what you're doing is you're just tying the decisions about indecent or profane content to the prevailing community standards that are appropriate for certain age groups, because it shouldn't be the same for all the age groups. It's
Right.
just that simple, right?
Right, it's just common sense. I don't think any of us who are parents treat our children the same and allow them to watch the same thing as they grow up. In fact, as I think Representative Weiner said before, we do movies differently, right? We have G, PG, PG-13, rated R movies, and we should have the same kind of differentiation when it comes to books. Some books are not appropriate for kids in elementary school, for younger kids in elementary school, and some of these books that aren't appropriate for them are appropriate for our students in high school. So we should treat that material differently, just like we do when it comes to movies, and just like we do in our own homes.
So are you actually suggesting through your amendment that you would replace that terminology of indecent and profane?
Right, we would replace it with one that takes into account the age of the child because it means different things to different ages of children.
And this community-based way of making these decisions, does this give too much power to specific communities to ban books and certain content?
No, actually, this doesn't mandate the removal of the books. It just sets standards for evaluating that content. And this prevailing community standards, this is a term that the courts recognize as one that is appropriate for this debate and this type of legislation. And it just would prevent us from making decisions where we would keep off limits books that are actually appropriate for kids of older ages.
Do you think there'd be a concern that this might soften censorship?
No, this is a safeguard. Without it, we use, in this bill, SB13 uses a blanket term that could be abused to silence essential perspectives. And this amendment creates a structure to balance it.
So give me some examples, if you can, of what kind of content might be evaluated under this standard.
Well, for instance, bad words, right? We know that some books have profanity in them that would not be appropriate for young students, but it's language that older students hear, and it's part of their experience. And so it makes sense to me that depending on their age, they should be able to have access to those
Actually,
words.
in my experience with my grandchildren, younger kids actually hear those words too from older kids and actually say them. I have actually changed saying bad words to saying words that hurt people's feelings because I think words are good in general. It's how you use them.
Right. That's
That
probably.
would be my community value there.
I just call them bad words.
How does this impact our teachers and librarians?
Well, it gives our teachers and librarians a tool to be able to help evaluate what kind of tools are important, and it gives them clarity and protection so they're not second guessing what might trigger a complaint when it comes to what is profane or appropriate, so that they have a clear standard to reference with respect to age.
And I know you've talked about elementary, middle school, high school, those kinds of differentiations, but does your amendment set very specific age brackets?
No, age brackets are always somewhat arbitrary. Rather than facing councils to use subjective boundaries, they should be empowered to take age appropriateness as a single factor in reviewing a library material's content.
Thank you for your amendment.
Thank you for your questions.
Mr. Speaker,
Mr. Raymond,
gentlelady yield for
would you yield?
a couple questions.
Okay.
She will.
Well, Chairman Buckley, I know Chairman Buckley is trying to work with everyone on this. You got me to thinking as I was listening to the amendment as you laid it out. So I think to give us all a better idea, what does it look like? So let's say this amendment passes, it's on the bill, let's say the bill becomes law. I guess where my mind went was, are you trying to say, for example, if you're in the 10th grade, whatever age that is now, 16, 15, 16? So let's say you're 16, and can you give us an example of where your amendment to get on what that would mean for that 16-year-old in terms of what they would be able to read?
The amendment is not prescriptive to say you'd have to do it a certain way, but it could be as easy as saying we're going to have a different standard when it comes to elementary schools versus middle schools versus high schools. It could be as easy as that.
Right, and so, and that's where I was going with it, is that what would the standard be where a 16-year-old would be able to read something that, let's say, an 8-year-old could not, right? That's where I'm going with it. Because I feel like maybe that kind of works into the common sense part. So, Huck Finn, you can read it when you're 16, but not when you're 8.
Well, no, you'd be able to read it at certain, whether it's high school or middle school. You're probably not reading it in elementary school, right?
Right.
But so certain books would be allowed in maybe it's certain grades. This amendment would allow for those local communities to decide, but it could be, again, as easy as different books for elementary, middle, and high school.
And so do you want to give examples, or you didn't give it?
Oh, I thought I was. I'm not understanding the question if I'm not.
Say again?
I thought I was giving examples, but I'm not understanding the question if you think
Well,
I'm
yeah,
not.
the books, a book,
Oh,
example of the book.
books. Oh,
This is about books.
It's been a long time since I've read those books.
Okay,
My memory's not the best, but
If you don't, that's fine. I just thought it would be good, because I think for some of the members, maybe it would be good where we hear, okay, yeah, I can, 16, yes. 8,
Right.
no. But if you don't,
Right.
that's fine.
well, I don't want to weigh in on this because I haven't really read books with that in mind, right? I was given books when I was in school that were age appropriate, right? I haven't had to, when I go, in fact, when I take my son to the bookstore, we have a conversation and we're looking for a book. We go to the kids section, right? And there's the young adult section, and then there's the younger kids section. So we go to those sections. So even our bookstores do it this way. And in conversation with, we go to Book People on Lamar, and they have very knowledgeable people who work there who can recommend books, and they help me find what is an age-appropriate book, because I'm probably not the person, unless I've read the book, to really be able to evaluate that. And I don't read before my son reads a book, every single book that he reads. My son has probably read more books than I have. He is such a strong reader, and I love that he loves to read, and that we've been fortunate to be able to give him access to books, but he also is exposed
The
to these
gentlelady's time
libraries.
has expired.
Thank you.
Chair
Move
recognizes
adoption.
Mr. Buckley on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I appreciate Representative Hinojosa bringing this amendment, and we had a great discussion about this morning, and I think we have a different opinion on where this belongs. And so in my perfecting amendment, what I do is I put in the hands of one of the duties of the local school library advisory council that one of their duties is to determine if a material is harmful material or material containing indecent content or profane content, inconsistent with local values or age appropriateness. So we put that in that section to leave it in the hands of the parents who have the ultimate responsibility of making the recommendation to the school board.
Mr. Speaker,
Ms. Weiner, for what purpose?
will the gentleman yield for a question?
Would you yield? Dr.
Absolutely.
Buckley? He will.
So Representative Buckley, I appreciate what you said about that language already being in some of these local councils. Now, are those local councils mandatory in the bill as currently written?
They are not. They're optional, but they do have. There's a parental trigger.
So would
that
you
could create
expect school boards to also use that same age determination that Representative Hinojosa laid out and that is there in the local councils?
I believe school boards would go through a similar process of making sure that that those materials are age appropriate and such. And again, you know, we talk about local values. Local values. The bedrock of local values are the moms and dads whose kids are in school, and then those that we entrust on our school boards that are elected locally.
Okay, yeah, so your hope, or at least your expectation, is that most people doing a book review, whether it's these local councils or not, would look at the age appropriateness of the material in determining whether it was profane or indecent. Is that correct?
I think that our local advisory council or local school boards or those closest to the people of that community, and that would certainly go into consideration as they approve a list for procurement.
Okay. I don't think we're there on the plain text right now, but I appreciate that that's how you hope it'll operate. Thank you.
All right, absolutely. And with that, I respectfully move to table this amendment.
Seat to close.
I appreciate the chairman's work that he's put into ensuring there is an age appropriateness standard when it comes to the councils, but this would be just for all school districts, even those that don't have the councils. And while I also appreciate that probably those who are making this decisions will take into account age appropriateness because it's common sense, I think it's important when we're talking about restricting access to books that we make that absolutely clear in the legislation to say that has to be a consideration when you're looking at what is profane, what is sexual content, all those things, because it means different things at different ages. And so I, again, urge your support for this motion that would make it crystal clear that these decisions should be made with respect to age appropriateness for our students in our schools. It would
Mr.
be
Speaker.
easy.
Ms. Weiner, for what purpose?
Will the gentlelady yield for a
Gentlelady
question?
yield for questions?
Yes.
She yields for questions.
Representative Hinojosa, I just want to make sure, as you said, it is crystal clear. All your amendment does is make sure that the standards for what is indecent and what is profane take into account whether we're talking about a high school, a middle school, or an elementary school library. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct.
Thank you.
Again, members, all we're doing is what the chairman said he hopes will already happen in our school districts, and that is taking into account age appropriateness when we make these determinations. Let's make it crystal clear so that we don't put our local leaders, our local school leaders, our local school board leaders in a position where they're not sure. Let's give them the confidence to know that it is okay to take into account age appropriateness when determining what content is prohibited and not prohibited in our schools. We owe them that. We owe them the clarity of outlining, especially on an issue that has become really a hotly debated issue amongst our communities. Let's have our local school communities' backs and give them the confidence they need to be able to make age-appropriate decisions when it comes to deciding how to interpret this legislation. And with that, I move adoption.
Ms. Hinojosa says of an amendment. Dr. Buckley has moved to table. The questions on the motion at table, clerk ring the bell. Show Dr. Buckley voting aye. Have all members voted? Have all members voted? 86 ayes, 61 nays. The motion to table prevails. Following amendment, clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment